and it's a bit contentious with the idea, though, of, like you said, political normativity. So it doesn't seem like the purpose of it exactly is to necessarily fight against the idea of fascism, but more it's the idea to just kind of go after Trump because you don't like Trump, right? Hang on, real quick, Destiny. What the are you doing? Just so I know.
He's building a new cuck chair. Andrew Wilson confronts Destiny about what a fascist is and why he calls Donald Trump a fascist. They go back and forth where Andrew Wilson tries to get to the bottom of Destiny's TDS. Let's see if he's successful.
And you went off on him about it, and you were saying, hey, look, this basically, and I'm paraphrasing, right? I don't remember the conversation verbatim, but it was something like, everybody on the left calls everybody on the right a fascist and a Nazi and a this and a that. And, like you basically kind of went off on him by asking him to just kind of define what a fascist even is. And he really wasn't able to. And so, I just wanted you to elaborate, because Trump being a fascist, he's a lot of things. I understand your rationale for most of the things you call Trump. I can at least understand it, if that makes sense. I can understand how you got there, but not the fascist thing. That I don't understand.
Sure. So, here's one thing I will say at the start. I feel like fascism is a very normatively loaded word, such that when people hear it, it just means kind of bad.
I agree.
Yeah, so there's that, but I think that one of the reasons why I got mad at Vosh in that conversation about calling Scalia or Bush a fascist is because if you call everybody a fascist, you can't really use the word anymore, it loses its power, which is where I'm at now, obviously, because if I call anybody a fascist, it's leftists have been calling everybody fascist for all the time or whatever, so it's like, okay, well, now it sounds like I'm
right,
doing that.
So you're kind of in the same boat, right?
Well, I don't think Scalia or Bush were fascists, but When I think of fascist, the two prongs that I'm usually thinking of are the ultra-nationalist part and then the authoritarian part. And I view both of these things as being like hyper-exaggerated aspects or elements of populism. We can go into either peg of that if you want. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, to kind of start with, I'm just wondering, and we had kind of touched on this a little bit at Jubilee, but have you talked to any of the third? Well, you have. You've debated with a couple of third positionists. I know. Politically Provoked set some up for you with what was his name?
I don't remember, but I've talked to third positionists before. Yeah.
Yeah, you've talked to third positionists before. So you have a pretty good grounding of what. These guys are like embedded in the ideology of fascism. Like they know it inside and out. Keith Woods, all those guys know. Have you kind of dove into any of that at all?
Not really. Not what they say in particular, no.
Yeah, so when they're saying fascism, they're talking about corporatism, which is the idea that the body of the state is made up of corporate entities, and that those corporate entities are there on behalf of the state and move on behalf of the state as the body of the state. And that's what they mean when they say fascism. They're looking at what Mussolini and Franco's Spain meant by fascism. So I understand you might have your own definition, but maybe that's what I'm kind of trying to dive into a little bit.
That might be the case. I think maybe historically in the first parts of when fascism was kind of a thing, I think that's how it was understood, right? I could be making this up, but wasn't the term privatization invented for Hitler privatizing and then deploying corporate entities in Nazi Germany or whatever for the state?
I'm not sure if that's where the term privatization came from,
okay.
But I do know for sure that what fascism was, because they were all the guys who invented fascism came out of communist theory, and communism wasn't working for Italy, and fascism was actually a response to communism. And so that's the idea was to stop large trade syndicates from swallowing up small trade syndicates, essentially. That's what now that's an oversimplification, but that's kind of what fascist theory and third positionism is. But you just kind of mean something totally different by it, it sounds like.
Like I said, those are the two pegs that I judge it on. Historically, it might have had a different definition. That's totally possible. If somebody wants to fight me on the definition of fascism, I would probably just immediately concede, because that's not the most interesting part to me. Kind of like how, if I'm debating somebody who wants to argue about communism, depending on how obstinate I'm being, I'm not going to start screaming at the person, well, actually, communism implies a paperless, stateless society, so you're totally wrong. Because when they say communism, usually what they just mean is really huge overreach of government and maybe like high taxes or whatever, you know. So I just
yeah. You mean like the conservative spurgs who are like everybody's a communist and everything's a communist. If the government's involved at all, it's communist. like
yeah,
that type of
basically.
thing.
So I probably I would just argue with people about, okay, well, what are you arguing? Like, is the government expansion bad or whatever? But it depends on the style of the conversation, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you say, okay, so I think we're getting some clarification here. So you mean when you say fascism, your meaning is a historical standard which applies to authoritarianism and protectionism, right? Is that correct? Kind of correct?
Yeah, kind of. Protectionism being like one of the legs of the hyper or the hyper ultranationalism or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, how would you then, because like a guy like Vosh would agree with this. He would agree that these are at least legs of fascism. And I think I would even agree that this could be considered a leg of fascism. If you're saying there's multiple pillars that hold up a fascist system, I think that authoritarianism and protectionism could easily be kind of related into two of those legs. But then how would you kind of push back against a guy like Vosh when he's calling basically all right-wingers fascists, because they do want a degree of authoritarianism. I think leftists do too, to a degree. And they do want to have some type of protectionism, at least tariffs. They seem to be for that and this type of thing. But I mean, isn't that exactly kind of what you were going off on?
Real quick, who else is surprised that Destiny could actually move these desks around? I mean, with those scrawny little arms of his, I'm surprised he could move anything around his apartment. But this is just fascinating to me how long it's taking just to get, well, why do you think Donald Trump's a fascist? Like, get to it. Like, what, you know, Andrew Wilson's trying to understand where Destiny is coming from. It's pretty simple to me. Destiny has Trump derangement syndrome, and I'm not even saying that to be facetious or to joke around or whatever. There are people who I cover on this channel who I do think suffer from this like Trump derangement syndrome. Like they truly have this derangement of Donald Trump and truly believe that he is like this worst thing ever, due to the constant manipulation and propaganda of the media for the last 8 or so years, the heavy propaganda from the left-wing media. So to me, it's quite simple. That's why he thinks Donald Trump is a fascist. But let's see if they actually get to the point of this. If Destiny actually answers the question while he tries to move around his furniture, whatever this is that's going on.
Right.
I mean, like, the reality is every single thing in life exists on a spectrum, whether you're talking about, like, well, maybe not everything. I guess if somebody's dead, they're not. But, like, you know, if we're talking about, like, mental illness, like how...
maybe death's a spectrum.
Sure.
I don't know. But anyway, go ahead.
Like, what is a democracy? Like, a lot of people right now will argue, I don't know if you say this or not, I'm trying to like start an argument on this, but some people will say like, oh, America's not a democracy because we don't like directly vote on every single thing. It's like, okay, well, that's not really true. But, or like, is a particular thing like authoritarian? Like, authoritarianism exists on a spectrum. You know, if you were to go to the wandering tribes of the Middle East prior to the establishment of any states, like, to them, every single government is going to be authoritarian because these people have ultimate freedom to do whatever they want, and anybody telling them you can or can't do anything is going to feel authoritarian, right? So, I mean, it all exists on a spectrum. So, I guess when I'm, as an American citizen with an American tradition and history, when I talk about authoritarianism, my perspective is probably going to be compared to what I think the intention and the ordinary operation of the U.S. system is. I would say that Trump is an authoritarian, is what I would say.
Yeah, so I can understand the idea of how you got to authoritarianism with the separate slate of electors, this type of thing. I get that. Like, I can understand the rationale. But in this, I largely agree with you if you're saying kind of everything's on a spectrum. I can say the same thing about Christianity, right? There's Christian ethics. There's lots of people who follow various forms of Christian ethics, but I wouldn't call them Christians. And I don't think that they would even self-identify as being Christians because they wouldn't fit the other criteria which are necessary. And so I guess in this, when you're talking about fascism, if you say, well, these are two legs of fascism, I think I could even agree that that's true. I guess the only thing that I would want some clarity on is, like, you wouldn't say Trump is a fascist, though. Like, just like I wouldn't say you are a Christian because you follow some forms of Christian ethics, right? There would be other criteria there.
I mean, I guess it depends on where it's. I mean, I feel like at this point it's a big semantic conversation. Not that semantics are bad or not important.
Yeah,
obviously.
No, I agree.
Semantics are essential, but it's like whatever this like narrowing of the conversation would be a thing that I'm not as interested in. If it was like, what is the historical tradition and definition of fascism, and would XYZ leader qualify for it? That's just a conversation I'm not generally having. But if generally when I say Trump is a fascist, and then I say Trump, I believe that he exhibits characteristics that are hyper-nationalist and ultra-authoritarian, what I'm really saying when I say Trump is fascist is I'm emoting Donald Trump has tendencies that are far more authoritarian than what I think the US system was or should be designed for. And Donald Trump has ultra-nationalist tendencies that go further and beyond what a free liberal capitalist society should be designing for, is really what I'm saying.
So with that argument, I don't think he has, like, Donald Trump has this like hyper nationalist mindset that's even beyond what's normal nationalism. Like, I think he has a pretty standard thinking of nationalism. And in terms of like authoritarianism or fascism, as Destiny says, I mean, I have way more evidence that Joe Biden under his administration was way more authoritarian than Donald Trump. I want to say that Joe Biden used more executive orders, I believe, like on his first few days under the term of his presidency. I got to double check that. If you want to fact check me in the comments, go right ahead. But I want to say Joe Biden used way more executive orders, even just within those first few days of the presidency. Joe Biden under his presidency, forced people to take a vaccine in order for people to live their lives. He used social media. He tried to use social media to control narratives and such. He's persecuting his political opponent in Donald Trump. Joe Biden straight up incited hatred toward half of the U.S. population for being Trump supporters, calling MAGA extremists. I'm just saying that Joe Biden, if you want to argue about who's the fascist, like Joe Biden and the Democrats just in general, are way more fascist than Donald Trump. And yet here I am. I don't come on here and say, man, Joe Biden's such a fascist. He's a fascist. Don't vote in Kamala Harris because she's part of the fascists. Like, I don't even come on here and do that, even though I have a objective case to make that Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, the Democrats are way more fascist than Donald Trump and the Republicans. It's because I'm not mentally ill.
Yeah, well, I think I understand all that too. But to kind of narrow in on this, right? And I'm not trying to be overly semantic at all,
Sure.
to be honest with you.
When I say semantic, I just mean defining words. I don't think arguing semantics is not necessarily bad. It's it's essential.
No, it's good. It's good for a conversation. The thing is that here's my disconnect. You and I both know that the word fascist is a super loaded term now, right? Politically, it's a loaded term that leftists essentially, or left-wingers, progressives, liberals, Democrats, whatever kind of group you want to associate, use this as a way to attack their opposition. And they're basically calling them Nazis, right? That's basically what they're saying. Is when they say fascist, they're using it as a kind of intermediate to say you're a Nazi. So when you say, what I'm trying to get clarified is when you say Trump is a fascist, right? You're kind of bringing all of that loaded terminology up into bear when it may not actually apply. And I guess that's why that particular position that you had, it's the other ones are all rational. Like all the positions you had at Jubilee, I thought were totally rational. They made sense from your worldview. That one doesn't seem that rational, though. That seems like you're just kind of using like rhetorically loaded language because it's super effective, right?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. The issue just comes to what do you want to fight over and what do you want to give up? Because we all know this in this space, that technically every word and every definition and every thing is so beyond warped and stretched. There were some things that were there was at least one thing that was part of the Green New Deal that was genuinely socialist. Nobody talks about this because everything was socialist, but if I'm not mistaken, in part of the Green New Deal, Bernie Sanders and AOC, I think they worked together on authoring this, or maybe just AOC, I don't remember. Part of the plan was to expropriate 20% of every single U.S. corporation and turn it over to the employees of those corporations. That's an actual socialist policy. That's not.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah, that's not that's not just a more government redistribution, higher taxes. That's an actual socialist policy. And I would say that as such. I would say this is an actual socialist policy. I don't know how I feel about this, but if I say that, I know that now I'm going to have to fight through the the definitions of everything. But the issue is just I don't like just giving up every single word, because it's like, well, I can't talk about, fascism, I can't talk about socialism, I can't talk about toxic masculinity or feminism or whatever the you're gonna say, because everybody's like destroyed the meanings of these words because they've used them so much. So I guess like in my dream scenario, I call Trump a fascist. Somebody says, what do you mean by fascist? And then I say, these are the two legs of fascism. And then we argue over whether or not Trump qualifies for that. But I don't know, there could maybe be a better way to approach it, but I don't know.
It's funny because Destiny says, well, it's because other people kind of ruined the word. Like, well, he's one of these people that are ruining the word. He's also just throwing it around by calling Donald Trump that. He's one of these people that are diluting this word. It sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong in the comment section, it sounds to me like what Destiny is pretty much saying is, well, listen, if I have to go and define every single word, then what word? It's kind of the same thing as the Cenk Uygur and Hassan Piker. Like, they said kind of the same thing. Like, well, if I can't call him a fascist, then what's the point of even having that word? That's what it sounds like Destiny is kind of saying to me. And it's like, well, no. How about, and hear me out, Destiny, and anyone else who thinks like Destiny, how about Donald Trump just isn't a fascist? Did that ever cross your mind? That maybe he's just not a fascist? And when you call him that, you're wrong. Why don't you give that a shot?
Okay. Well,
there's a bunch of normative baggage that gets dragged in. Although some of that is intentional too. Like I think that fascism is bad. Much the same that if I call somebody a socialist or communist or tanky, I also think that's bad, and I'm trying to signal that too. So maybe.
But when you were in that Vosh debate, you made a good point that, and you've made it before, and I make it all the time as well, which is that, look, even the bad guys sometimes do good things, right? So just saying, hey, this is a fascist policy or this or that doesn't even necessarily make it a bad policy any more than there's probably some socialist policies that you might be able to get behind, or that type of thing. Just because bad guys also did thing doesn't mean thing bad. Kind of on its face. So
maybe I guess I would even go a step further, and I would say that there are very few forms of economic or political organization that have like a normative value. There are probably some, like I might maybe actually I don't know if I would say any, because my example I was going to say maybe slavery is always bad. But I don't know if that's true if we're talking about, like, let's say that in the United States, let's say that if you go to jail, let's say that you can get out early if you agree to do 20 hours of community service. Like, does that count as slavery? Like, I don't know, maybe.
Well, there's other forms of that too. Like, for instance, if you're in a war with another nation and your option is to either take out the civilian population or enslave them, would it be more optimal to enslave them? That way they weren't at your back. There's all sorts of ways I think we could make moral justifications for these things, right?
Sure, yeah. So I try to, it's impossible and it's completely futile, but I try to tell people to divorce, like don't think about economics or governments like normatively. But you can fight, or rather, you can get normative value to them, but you have to like build it up. You can't just say it offhand. Like there are democracies that have been worse than some authoritarian regimes. There have been republics that have been worse than monarchies. There's a lot of other stuff going on there. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I can actually agree essentially with all this. So maybe I guess now that we're kind of on the same page, so if Trump does have these said kind of like fascist style policies from your worldview, do you think that those are always bad? Like protectionists and tariffs, for instance. You don't think all tariffs are bad? Biden has some, right? And that's a form of protectionism. So there's some kind of threshold there, obviously, for when too much is too much, right?
Yeah, so so we have to get into the weeds on like econ stuff, but the issue that I have when it comes to tariffs is that tariffs, when they're used, they do particular things and they don't do other things, and people aren't always honest about the things that they do and the things that they can't do. So then they lie about when they're putting tariffs on. So for instance, if somebody were to tell me we need to put tariffs on China when it comes to manufacturing microprocessors, because if we went to war with China, we're going to be fucked if they like pull the plug on all that. So if you want to say we should tariff to protect that industry, what you're saying is we need to have a tariff for national security purposes. Okay? Now, That's a fine argument, and I agree with that argument. I think that's good. There probably are some things that we should manufacture at home in the event of war. However, if you try to pair that with saying, well, this is all going to be economically good at the same time, well, hold on. That's probably not true. If you're doing these tariffs for national security reasons, they're probably not also going to be economically beneficial. So you have to be honest about what we're doing. I don't think all protectionism is bad, but there's a macro theory of why you're protecting industry that can make me disagree with all of your tariffs, even if some of the tariffs are good. Like if you're, do you know,
okay, I understand what you're saying. But kind of on this is kind of moving against the view then, I think, a little bit. So what you're saying is like, yeah, of course there's times where protectionism is totally appropriate, totally fine. In this case, you cite you could have some foreign adversary who you might potentially have war with, and so you want to make sure that they're not making the very components which are going to go in the weapons that you're going to use to defeat them, let's say. So yeah, absolutely. But on the other hand, that could give us kind of a little bit of economic downturn. Fair enough. I can agree with that too. But the thing is like, so if Trump's idea here is to put these types of tariffs on, and you don't agree with them because you think there's going to be an economic downturn, or perhaps you don't even agree that the people he's putting them on are potential enemies, that doesn't seem still to me to be particularly authoritarian, right? That just kind of seems like maybe you would think he was just a bumbling idiot, right? Not so much like a fascist authoritarian.
Yeah, sure. So to be clear, so two things. So one, nothing about the tariffs are technically authoritarian unless he tries to do all of it via executive order. That could be arguably authoritarian. These would fall under the ultra-nationalist part. The reason why I oppose Trump and his tariffs is because, are you familiar with the term autarky?
Yeah.
Yeah. The idea seems to be that a good country is a country that has in-housed all of its supply chains. And I think that for a whole bunch of economic reasons, that's really dumb. Or I shouldn't say dumb. I just don't think that's possible. And I think it hurts your economy overall. And I think that all of Donald Trump's tariffs are built around this concept of autarky. So even if he does tariff some things, and I would agree with why he's tariffing a thing, I wouldn't agree with any of the tariffs because I would say, well, the place that these tariffs are coming from is not just, it's not like a theory that I would agree with. Even if you might do something, I think, oh, this probably could be beneficial though in the long run or whatever.
Okay, yeah, so I think I understand that, and that's rational. That's rational to me. The reasoning behind it makes sense, whether I agree with it or disagree with it, it totally makes sense. But then with the idea, though, of the two pillars that you're using here to call him a fascist, the tariffs and protectionism that you're pointing to then doesn't seem like that would stand as as one of those pillars, because it doesn't seem like he's doing it from a position of some kind of authoritarianism or even a consolidation of power, but just maybe perhaps from your view because he's a bumbling idiot and doesn't understand economics, right?
Well, no, the authoritarian stuff is going to come from the centralization of power into the presidency. These would be on the, like I said, these would be on the nationalist side. Like there are going to be some policies that you take that might be nationalist or ultra-nationalist, and then there are going to be some things that you might take that would be authoritarian, but not necessarily like nationalist.
Well, let me make sure I got it right. The two pillars again. The first pillar is authoritarianism,
and then the other one is hyper-nationalism. So like here's an example. Yeah. You might argue that you're kind of familiar with DACA, right?
Yeah.
I think you could argue that DACA is a type of authoritarianism, right? Where the executive, Donald Trump, is using with wide discretion some immigration measures that are given to the president. I think it's called TPS, maybe Temporary Protective Service, in order to basically legalize a form of immigration that he couldn't legalize from the Congress. We could say that that might be a kind of authoritarianism. You're grabbing more power for the executive branch. But is that a form of nationalism to be using the authoritarianism to get more like immigrants protected in the country? Probably not. So that would be like a form of authoritarianism that's not really a form of like nationalism or hyper-nationalism, right?
Well, wouldn't the form of nationalism just be based around kind of the idea that the person is doing something which puts the nation above all other nations, right? Something akin to this?
I mean, you could say that, but I feel like at that point we're broadening the definition so much that you could make anything into anything, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think that's fair. So maybe
I think nationalism usually implies some form of like native protection, native being non-immigrant, and usually some shared ethnic character. Not necessarily racial, but some shared ethnic character.
Yeah, like cultural nationalism, the idea that we have one language and some type of cultural cohesion, this kind of thing doesn't necessarily have to include race, but there has to be some kind of criteria which is shared amongst the group.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that's fine. But I mean, Democrats have also done this. I mean, and they do it all the time when it comes to immigration acts and things like this, where you definitely want to. They definitely seem to still want to select from countries which have a greater base of educated immigrants if they can, right? So I'm not even sure if that would meet this criteria for the second leg necessarily.
So I'm not opposed to the concept of nationalism or being like patriotic or doing things that are in the benefit of your nation. I think all of those things are fine. It's this concept of extreme hyper-nationalism, this concept of it's not just enough for us to be good or the best, but we might even start doing that to the large detriment or expense of other people because we are like better than those people and we don't even need those people. And it's this like island concept, basically, that the autarky thing is what I'm harkening back to a lot. And I feel like, even Republicans before Trump didn't really venture off into that direction much.
And I don't see that at all. It's more like Donald Trump just wants to put us first again because he saw how we were being taken advantage of by other countries. Like, we're always sending money to other countries, and what is it? Is it the the UN, or the whole that agreement? I forgot what it's called at the top of my head, and I'm sorry for that. Too lazy to pause the video and look it up. But the agreement that everyone's supposed to pay into, and basically no one else was really paying into it, just us. It was like people were taking advantage of us, and pretty much Donald Trump would just want to put a stop to that. Was just like, hey, why are we putting all these other countries before us? He just wanted to put us before all the countries, which I don't think that's hyper nationalism. To Destiny, that might be hyper nationalism, but it's not. It's just nationalism. And how is us doing that to the detriment of the other countries exactly? Yeah, if like someone was like borrowing money from you, like you're just giving someone money every month and then one day you cut them off or something, I guess that's to the detriment of that person. But does that person have the right to your money? And that's the thing. Do these other countries have a right to our money or to our tax dollars? I don't know. If I'm off on anything about that, guys, sound off in the comment section. If you enjoy content like this, subscribe to my channel. Let's continue.
No, not really. When you're talking about ultra nationalism, I think I have the same kind of general idea that you're putting America first. You're talking about things like American exceptionalism. You're talking about how you're going to put your people before any other peoples on planet Earth. I'm not sure though how that's bad exactly, but or even necessarily fascist. Like Japan does this, right? They tailor all policies, except they do have a racial element, right? But they tailor all policies to the interest of the Japanese over all of the groups. I would say that's ultra nationalist, but it definitely doesn't seem like it's a fascist nation to me. They even have fascist leaders.
Definitionally, weren't they fascists like in World War II? They're not now anymore, right? Probably not.
No, they were imperialists.
Wasn't an imperialist fascist country though? Like
no, they weren't really. Again, so this is where we get into the kind of semantics that I'm trying to avoid, so it doesn't get too pedantic, right?
Okay, I'll ditch fascist then, because they believed like in the racial superiority of the Japanese ethnic group over every other like Asian population, like in the when they were doing like the Sino-Japanese War and everything, right? Like that was
for sure. For sure.
Sorry, okay, that's what I mean when I say so. Maybe not fascist in the World War II definition of such, but okay.
Most definitely. I don't think they are now though, but they still have those policies in place.
Yeah, they might. I'm only saying they might, not because I disagree, but I don't know. But they might. But even if they do, I don't care.
Well, they basically just don't take in immigrants. So the Japanese, idea is to keep Japan Japanese.
Yeah. I don't like, but I don't like Japanese stuff. Like I'm not a Japanese person. I'm an American person, and I have a different set of values for my country.
No, I agree. I agree with that. I'm just I guess the only reason I'm drawing the parallel is because I don't think that even if they're ultra nationalists by the sense that you're talking about here with these two legs of fascism, that we would call them fascists. I think that would be very difficult to do.
That's probably true. But remember back to the beginning of the conversation, when I say fascist and I define this as like ultra-nationalist and authoritarian, I'm saying with respect to where like American democratic liberal capitalist values are at. So like
Okay.
there might be things that Japan does that are like arguably our good friend state Israel, right, has like immigration policies that work for Israel, and I would say could be justified for Israel. But if we were to do the same thing in the U.S., I'd say, hold on, this is not good. That we shouldn't be doing these types of policies. I can understand why this country might do it for different reasons. Maybe Japan has good reasons. I would say probably Israel has like decent reasons, but I don't know if the U.S. would have like the same type of justification.
So then it really does come down to if you had other nations who had the exact same policies, they're not fascist policies. But if our nation introduced those policies, they would be fascist policies because they're against what you consider the spirit of Americanism to be.
Yeah, like
So it's not really a defined concept then, or a hard concept. It's just basically like not what you consider non-American idealism or not in the spirit of American idealism is fascism.
Well, I mean, like the thing is I feel like every kind of political concept is rooted in the history of the country, right? Like if I were to be an American Christian and I were to go to, you know, the strictest places in Afghanistan, which is all of Afghanistan now, and I would say, wow, women wearing burqas, this is disgusting. Women shouldn't be forced to cover up like this. Like that's gross. And then that very same Christian could go to, I don't know if in New York it's legal to walk around topless. In New York, she might say, this is fucking disgusting. Like, I have children here. Why aren't these women covering up, right? Is she like a hypocrite because she wants like women to look one way in one country and in another country she thinks they've gone too far?
No, that would be the idea of cultural pluralism or ethical pluralism. I think that everybody engages in that. So I'm just kind of willing to.
Well, also, that's like, those are totally different, like, extremes. Like, if you go to a country and everyone's covered up if the women are covered up from head to toe, where you can't see their faces or anything, that's a little extreme. That's a little too much. But then if you go to New York and the woman is topless, well, that's also, like, the other end of the spectrum. Like, there is a middle where you could just be dressed and you're not overdressed and you're not underdressed. That... I don't know. I don't know what point Destiny was trying to get at there, but that was a horrible example.
Bite the bullet on cultural pluralism or ethical pluralism.
Wait. Can you?
I'll give.
When you say that,
yep.
what does that mean? I don't know what you mean. When you say
Yeah,
that.
I'll give you an idea of this. So, in Christianity, we follow the Ten Commandments, right?
You should, yeah.
Yeah, we should. Okay, so one of the Ten Commandments is honor thy mother and father. You agree? Okay, so one of the ways that you would honor them if you were in Japan would be to take your shoes off when you went in the door, but not in the United States. So is it dishonorable for you to not take your shoes off because other Christians take their shoes off? The answer is no. So the idea here is it's ethical pluralism. The idea is that the culture is going to inform some of the idea, and what we're trying to do is get to the principle rather than the legalism of the idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would probably 1,000,000,000% agree with that. That's why, and I'm sure you figure this out in debating people and hearing their like concepts or their theories or their values or whatever, it doesn't actually mean anything until they give you an example. Because it's once you get examples, you realize, okay, when you say that you think that families should be free to make what they think are the right decisions, to one group of people, that might mean I should be able to deny my child to get blood transfusions because I think that this is an evil. And for another group of people, it might be I want my 7-year-old to have hormone replacement therapy because I think they're trans, right? So both these people could have the same, theoretically, a similar sounding set of principles, but until you hear the examples, you really have no idea what they're talking about. So
yeah, well, and the idea is to adhere to the principle. So it's the same in Christianity or almost all ethics. Even utilitarians, I think, would agree. Okay, we have a principle, but there's more than one way to get to the idea of the principle, and so. There's more than one way to walk down the path, essentially, for this kind of ethical view, because human beings are infinitely complex, and there's many different ways to honor thy mother and father. My neighbor's going to do it a different way than I do it. It doesn't mean that they're wrong. So that moves into like the pluralistic aspect of cultural pluralism or this type of thing. Christianity is always embrace this. I'm sure when you were in Catholic school, something similar to this was explained. But again, when we're talking about this, if I am to say what a Christian was, like let's say we said it's somebody who says Jesus Christ is their Lord and Savior, right? Something really broad like this. That's still pretty definitive criteria for what we mean when we're saying Christian. And so we know what to rule out of that. That's like a whole lot of people we get to rule out immediately. I think that kind of where your analogy fails here is Yeah, I think that if they go and they see a burqa and say that's disgusting, but then, oh, hey, you have to cover your boobs up, they're still adhering to the same principle. And so in this kind of idea of fascism, I think they're still adhering to the same principle that you find disgusting. It's just that you kind of just say, well, it's just kind of basically based around the cultural aspect, the cultural pluralism of the adherence to the principle. Americans find it disgusting, so I don't like it. But for another culture, fascism might be okay, right?
Yeah, I think I largely would agree with that. Yeah. But I think that like I think you could apply this down the road to anything. Like for instance, if you were to ask me like are sweatshops okay, I would have to ask in what context. In the United States, I would think that sweatshops would be disgusting. But in like a community where every single family was engaged in subsistence farming and a flood meant that like half the population was going to starve and die, I might say, okay, well, sweatshops is a huge upgrade to these people's standard of living. It's actually way better. So yeah, I think that I don't know if I would be like fascism or like modes of government as these like defined, fundamental, like axiomatic things. I think that you get like a whole bunch of statements and values from them, but then you have to plug in a whole bunch of other concepts that are more relative, basically, right? So like a liberal might say, like a capital L liberal might say like, oh, like freedom of the press is really important. And then somebody else might say like, oh yeah, we have great freedom of the press here. You can say things to your family members and the government won't even come and murder you for it. And it's like, okay, wait, do you have like newspapers or anything like that? Like, no, all the media is state ran. But I'm saying like, you're never gonna be executed for saying something to your neighbor. And I'm like, okay, well, so you might have like the same value system there, but then you have to plug in, I think like what ultimately end up being, I mean, I would argue, obviously as a atheist, hedonistic atheist, whatever, I would argue that that all of these things are relative to the cultures that they exist in.
Yeah, well, I understand the cultural relativism aspect. Again, that's rational and it's reasonable to me. But if you say like democracy, right? When you tell people, okay, this country's a democracy, you're clearly talking about a very crystal clear criteria, right? There's not that much movement which is allowed in there. It's like that means that the people are participating in the form of whatever type of government or law that they want. The people are choosing that by some methodology, usually voting. I think that almost everybody would largely agree to this. And so I think you would agree to it too. And so if I said this isn't a democracy, you know exactly what I'm saying, what I'm talking about instantly. You know that I'm talking about people not having any ability to participate in their form of government, essentially.
So this would be something.
With fascism, I feel like that's kind of we're not there with this, right? This is kind of a different thing you're talking about.
So I feel like with that democracy thing, I actually would super disagree with that. I think that when we say democracy, I don't know if there's an agreement on what that means or what that is. I would look to like reading through a lot now of the Federalist Papers, I can see that there were so many arguments made for different parts of the government or how they should function or what's too much or what's not enough or what's an appropriate check and balance or should the people be voting or should electors be voting for president or
well, hang on real quick, Destiny. What the are you doing? Just so I know.
He's building a new cuck chair.
I know what you're doing. Most people are asking, they're like, what is he doing? I'm like, I don't know.
I have a studio that I shoot all my podcasts in, but for the election day, I'm going to have I've got a second room here, and I'm creating like a secondary studio room here for the election day. So I'm just setting up like
you're doing live coverage?
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to derail you, dude. Go ahead. No, you were talking about democracy.
Yeah, I think that what a democracy is and what it's for is actually, I think that's actually a really complicated question. Like, for instance, 90% of ethnicity A and 10% of ethnicity B. Should ethnicity A be able to vote should they be able to vote to enslave ethnicity B, right? Some people would say that that's democracy, right? But then, I mean, obviously you've got that, I don't even know if Ben Franklin said it, but there's that quote of like 2 lambs and a wolf or 2 wolves and a lamb or whatever. Some people say,
fighting over what to have for dinner.
Yeah. Some people say, well, no, you need to protect the rights of minorities. That's actually more democratic. But is that really more democratic? That in a way, that's a bit of a tyranny of the minority. So some people might say that like, well, minorities having an outsized like influence on the government by getting special protections is not fair. But then those same people who maybe they're probably conservatives would say things like the Electoral College or the Senate composition that is fair, that states should have an outsized influence, not just population, but states. So I think that like, I would disagree heavily that the idea that like, what is democracy, that's like a super crystallized concept. I think they're still fighting to this day over what a democracy should be or what it looks like. I don't know if everybody.
Well, I think if you said a republic, I would agree with you. If you said what is a republic, I think that would be harder for the. I think that would kind of be a better descriptor for all of those things. Like in a republic, where people have the right to vote. Are we going to protect minority rights, the rights of women? Are we going to protect this? Are we going to protect that? We have constitutional constraints, or what sort of republic do you want? But I think democracy itself is just basically people voting for a thing that they want. I mean, I don't really know what else it would be. Other
Well, I mean,
than
like,
that.
let's say that we do a vote. Let's say there was a referendum in the next election on not only are you voting for the presidential candidate, we're voting to enslave the other half of the population. So whoever wins the popular vote gets to take the other half as slaves. Like, would you say that's democratic? And then yes or no, and then why?
Yeah. So that would be, I think that because a democracy can use democracy to vote democracy out, doesn't make it less of a democracy. That's still that would still be the democratic process, right?
Yeah, but would what exists afterwards, would that still be democratic?
No, I don't think that would be. So, like I said, I think you can use democracy. So you could go to the people and you could say, how about you vote away your right to vote?
Yeah.
Right? And they all go, okay, sure. And they do that. Well, now they have no more right to vote, right? But they use their right to vote to do it. Yeah, I mean, that would still be a democracy. I wouldn't see how that wouldn't be a democracy.
Sure, I guess I feel like what if you did have a right to re-vote on that every 4 years and you were just a slave for the 4 years while you were waiting for the next election?
Yeah.
There are ways that we can kind of like work around these, but I think at the end of the day, I really do think that what a democracy is, that's a very I feel like it's a very abstract concept. Like, I think at its root, democracy is really just saying that, like, the people. And that's like a very broad term. Even that, right? Are black people? How early you go in the U.S. do women count as people that vote? Or what about do non-citizens count as people? Democracy, in the very broadest sense, is like citizens having their will represented in the country through some form of ballot.
Yeah, I agree. It's just it's the idea that citizens have their will represented and can somehow participate. So I think that, like, the broadest, most charitable kind of definition I can give would be that as well. But I still think that that's still a very particular criteria that we can apply to things. When we're talking here about fascism, that doesn't seem so clear to me in this. It just seems kind of like if it's just an abstract concept, then anything that anybody does which could meet these potential two legs, I could just kind of call them a fascist. And I don't think that that's getting at the spirit of what you're saying.
I mean, you can. I mean, at the end of the day, a label is just a label. Ideally, it's like it's a jumping point for further conversation. But I mean, like, if you want to say that, then theoretically you could get more reductive. So, like, theoretically, there's a world where Stephen never calls somebody a fascist, but instead I just say, well, these people are actually they're ultranationalist, hyper-authoritarians. And then you come in and you call me and you're like, hey, I want to talk to you about what ultranationalist means. And we could have this exact same conversation where you're like, okay, well, ultranationalists exist in this, like, culturally relative vacuum, and you shouldn't be saying ultranationalists. You should have said, X, Y, or Z or whatever. And then, right, it could get, like, reductive from there, right?
Yeah, well, and with that, again,
Well, I mean, he would still be wrong. Even if he just called Trump a hyper-nationalist authoritarian, he would still be wrong. The problem, Destiny seems to think it's like the words he's choosing. That's the issue. It's not it's just that he's wrong. It would be like if I said, oh, Destiny's a female. And they're like, no, Destiny's not a female. He's a man. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't know. It doesn't look like a man to me. He's a female. And they're like, okay, well, maybe I don't think you should be calling that. Like, let's define what a female is. And then we go through all that BS. And then I go, okay, well, listen, I could say that he's a person that has no man parts and we would still be here. And people would be like, no. Maybe I chose a bad example because I think people would be agreeing that Destiny's not a man. But you see what I'm going with here. Like, I would be wrong no matter if I called him a woman, a female, if I just said he's a person that doesn't have male parts. All of that would just be objectively wrong. Okay, if we're going to be serious here. Enough kidding around, ladies and gentlemen. I know you want to see me kid around, but no kidding around. If we're all being serious, I would be wrong in calling him that. It's not the words that I'm choosing. It's just that I'm just factually incorrect. And Destiny, when he calls Donald Trump a fascist, hyper-nationalist, authoritarian, he's just wrong. That's the issue here. Destiny doesn't see that. I'm going to let this play out a little bit longer because I want to see if he ever comes to this realization or if he just ends up living in his little TDS bubble here.
I'll kind of just grant this as being true as well, because I think it is. The thing is, though, is in that case, I think if you were to run around and call people that you politically disagreed with a bunch of hyper-authoritarian ultra-nationalists, that people honestly wouldn't care that much. They'd be like, okay, well, that's somewhat nebulous meaning, this and that. But if you say fascist, that brings up all the loaded baggage which comes with the word fascist. And so that, I guess that's ultimately what I'm getting at, is that it seems to me like you want to, and I do this too, we all do this, right? So to be totally fair, but it seems like you're pummeling that label specifically because of the loaded baggage that it has associated with it, especially with Nazis, right? And that's the purpose of it, rather than necessarily due to authoritarianism or trade agreements or tariffs or any of those types of things.
Yeah, and I think I said that early in the conversation, which is, I guess it's technically a little at ends what I said, where I'm like, people should divorce the normativity from their like economic labels or whatever.
Yeah, but I mean, rhetoric's rhetoric, right?
Yeah, but I mean, like when I'm saying somebody is fascist, I am trying to evoke, same with if I call somebody a tanky or a socialist, I am trying to evoke some negative, like normative baggage there. That is the goal, because I don't think that like we shouldn't be okay. I mean, I would argue that we shouldn't be okay being hyper nationalist authoritarians. Like we've seen what that looks like in the past, and I'm trying to evoke all of that feeling when I say that. Yeah, but I mean. Okay,
well, so I mean, Socrates said himself. That rhetoric is anything which convinces external to logic. So whatever it is that is convincing for your worldview, that kind of sways people over to it, absent logic, you can kind of type up to rhetoric. I think that's what he meant by that. So I mean, at least I can kind of understand now a bit more the rationale if you're kind of with the admittance that, hey, yeah, you're right, it is somewhat nebulous, and it could be okay, these policies in other nations other than this, but this doesn't really conform to Americanism, and I'm using the label because it really puts a negative light on Trump. I mean, is that a fair
like what
assessment?
You just said there, that is a much less of a bite, right? Much the same that if you're like expanding income retribution to such a level that it's hard to achieve economic prosperity as an individual in the United States is not good. It's easier to just call somebody a communist or socialist, right?
Yeah.
There's a reason.
Yeah, well, and to bring the loaded rhetoric with it, right? Like, you commie, right? That's very helpful. I agree. But it does contend, it's a bit contentious with the idea, though, of, like you said, political normativity. So it doesn't seem like the purpose of it exactly is to necessarily fight against the idea of fascism, but more it's the idea to just kind of go after Trump because you don't like Trump, right?
Before Destiny gets into that, I just want to add real quick that if Destiny is just adding that he's just doing it to be polarizing, okay, that's fair, but then why does he jump down Trump's throat when Trump says things about certain people, or if Trump says something against illegal immigrants or this and that, like if it's okay this is what bugs me about the Democrats and the left. Like they're so hypocritical. Like, okay, well, if it's okay for them to be polarizing and they say this and that toward Republicans, Donald Trump, right wingers, conservatives, why is it not okay for us to do it then?
Yeah, I guess to bring it back to 2 points I made. So one point I said earlier that there's tension between now is I said earlier when people discuss like these particular perspectives, they should be it should be dispassionate and unnormatively loaded, right? An authoritarian is an authoritarian, a democracy is democracy. It's not necessarily good or bad. It just depends, right? On other values. When I'm in like debating when I'm debating something over somebody being better or worse, and then I think that you start to bake in more normativity when you're making statements. Like if I'm arguing against somebody and I'm bringing up the point, this guy wants to do this. Like even if that was a purely logical statement, right? If I were to say Kamala wants to increase taxes on the top 1% to 99%, right? In that statement, even if it's not there explicitly, there's normativity baked into it. I'm arguing against her and I just brought up a policy, it's probably bad, right? Yeah. Like if I was arguing with somebody and they were like, talk to me, you don't like Trump, like tell me about Trump. And I'm like, Donald Trump had a rich father. Your assumption, like you would hear that as me saying, Donald Trump having a rich father is bad. And then if you were to say, well, wait, what's wrong with that? And I go, oh, nothing. I'm just like stating a fact about Trump. You'd be like, wait, what the fuck? What do you mean you're stating a fact about Trump? Because we don't parse the language like a machine, right? We're in the context of the conversation. So going back to, so when I say analyze things like non-normatively, I'm talking about for like jerk off, like policy discussion, basically. But now to bring this back to the other point that's just kind of in tension with Vosh, when I said, why are you calling Scalia or Bush a fascist? The issue that I had there is that I didn't care so much that he was calling them a fascist. What I cared about is that if we were to have a discussion on why he's calling them a fascist, he wouldn't be able to back that up. He wouldn't be able to justify that. That was my big issue. Like, you can't just be that he's a fascist.
But aren't you at the same mercy of that? Like, when you say Trump's a fascist, you also have to back that up. And if it's just kind of this well, there's these two pillars which I think all fascists have in common. I think even like third positionists would agree that those two pillars could exist. But then if you say, from a cultural relative or cultural pluralist position, I can see why other countries do that, and I don't even actually have a problem with it. Just here, you would kind of be at the same mercy Vosh was at, wouldn't you?
I don't think so, because I think that the conversation that you're talking about right now, and I'm just reiterating this for you and the audience because it sounds like I'm attacking, but I'm not. The discussion we would have would be one of semantics, where we'd be saying, like, well, what do we mean when we say fascist? But the conversation that I would be debating Vosh on would be one of substance, where Vosh would say, well, no, so what Scalia is doing is ahistorical. It's like way too far away from what America should be. Like, we would have a debate on the substance of what does it mean to have American values and what does it mean to rule in ways that are congruent with American tradition. And I think that's what the debate would be, not just over whether or not I agree with his particular definition of fascism, right? Like, if I had a debate, like if we were debating and we didn't,
wouldn't you guys have to agree?
And you were to say, what?
Well, wouldn't you guys have to agree on what that meant to even have that substantive debate?
We could, but if Vosh were to just say, it would really depend on the conversation. But like, this would be the same with you and me. If Vosh were to say, well, when I say fascist, I just mean he's conservative, then I would say, oh, well, I think that's a dumb way to define fascist. But okay, I probably agree with you, but that's just a dumb way to define it. Then we would have a semantics debate. But I think with Vosh, we would disagree on substance, I think.
Rather than the semantics. Okay, I think I understand that as well. Okay, well, I think we got a lot of that clear.
I don't know if Andrew Wilson is just being really charitable to Destiny or whatever, but I don't understand what Destiny means at all. Like, I don't get why. Oh, when Vosh, it sounds like I have to Destiny sometimes talks so fast, it's hard to understand. And I think that's why he's able to get away with so much in debates, because he speaks so fast. So I have to sit here and process everything he just said. But what it sounded like to me, again, correct me in the comment section, it just sounded like the debate that he would have with Vosh over, like, well, what's a fascist, all these things. It sounds just like the conversation that him and Andrew Wilson just had right now. Doesn't it? I mean, did I miss anything? Comments, let me know if I'm wrong.
But the conversation that I would be debating Vosh on would be one of substance, where Vosh would say, well, no, so what Scalia is doing is ahistorical. It's like way too far away from what America should be. Like, we would have a debate on the substance of what does it mean to have American values and what does it mean to rule in ways that are congruent with American tradition. And I think that's what the debate would be, not just over whether or not I agree with his particular definition of fascism, right? Like, if I had a debate, like if we were debating and we didn't,
wouldn't you guys have to agree?
And you were to say, what?
Well, wouldn't you guys have to agree on what that meant to even have that substantive debate?
We could, but if Vosh were to just say, it would really depend on the conversation. But like, this would be the same with you and me. If Vosh were to say, well, when I say fascist, I just mean he's conservative, then I would say, oh, well, I think that's a dumb way to define fascist. But okay, I probably agree with you, but that's just a dumb way to define it. Then we would have a semantics debate. But I think with Vosh, we would disagree on substance, I think.
Rather than the semantics. Okay, I think I understand that as well. Okay, well, I think.
Okay, so he's just saying, oh, me and Vosh would have more of the substance but it just sounds like that's what him and Andrew Wilson just kind of had. Like, yeah, it was more about like the words, but it sounds like Andrew Wilson was trying to get to the bottom of, like, why does Destiny think Donald Trump is a fascist? And then they had this whole conversation where he doesn't give any examples. It was just like, well, what does the word mean? And it sounds like they just had this whole conversation. And yet he sits there and goes, well, me and Vosh would have more substantive conversation. Well, didn't you and Andrew Wilson just kind of have this? It sounds like you just had this whole substantive conversation. Oh my God. Destiny is really vexing. Ladies and gentlemen, if you like seeing Destiny embarrass himself, I have a whole playlist for you on the top left-hand corner.